Good morning. Good morning. Could we take our seats and ready for the second panel, please? Thank you. The title of the second panel is called Connecting People and Places, Designing Transportation Systems for Smart Cities. And so we have four panelists, and it's moderated today by Miles Bryan, a reporter and producer of WBEZ. The other panelists are Mary Sue Barrett, the president of the Metropolitan Planning Council, Ron Burke, the executive director of the Active Transportation Alliance, Clayton Harris III, the executive director of the Illinois International Port District, and Leanne Redden, the executive director of the Regional Transportation Authority. Turn it over to you and welcome. Thank you.
We'll accept that. Right.
Sir, we'll take that.
It's great to be here. I'm Miles Bryan. I'm a reporter at WBEZ News. And one of the best parts of my job, my favorite part of my job, is that I get to be out in the city all the time. Spend pretty much every day going to a different part of the city, engaging with different people on different issues. And something that I've gotten to see working at WBEZ is how the Chicago region, how the area's transportation networks affect us and how we affect them. Something I was thinking about coming in here is I've been interested in the growth of fulfillment centers, of warehouses in the south suburbs. There's a lot of jobs there. There's a lot of folks who need jobs, especially in the Southland, but it's really hard to get there, and there's not good transportation service there. So those jobs aren't quite as accessible to populations that might otherwise jump on them. But that's just the kind of thing that I think about. So before we jump into anything, I'm going to have everybody just say a little bit about who they are and what they do. Let me start with you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Burke, Executive Director with the Active Transportation Alliance. We're a not-for-profit here in Chicago that works to promote better biking, walking, and transit. We were originally called the Chicagoland Bicycle Federation. Some of you may remember that name. The mission expanded about 9 years ago to include advocacy around walking and transit as well. And the name was changed at that time to Active Transportation Alliance. So we're all about creating more multimodal communities because we know that cities and regions that are overly dependent on automobiles are generally not as healthy, not as economically vibrant, not as environmentally friendly, and ultimately, it's important to note that when you force people to own a car to get to jobs or to get to school or wherever, you've also created a situation that's not equitable. And unfortunately, that's where we are in Metro Chicago still today. And so I wanted to just throw out three numbers right off the bat, just to kind of, actually I want to take a step back, do a quick survey. So who got here today by transit? Raise your hands. Awesome. Okay, so I've done this before. I know Mary Sue's seen me do this before. So this is our reality check, okay? Only about 13% of people in the Chicago region get to where they're going by transit. 13%. Even in the city of Chicago, it's only about 28% use transit. How many of you got here by rail? Okay, all right. So you're even more in the minority, right? Because actually in Chicago, about half the trips by transit are by bus. So I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about how people get around the Chicago region. In the suburbs, for example, here's a number I want you to remember, 90%. So 90% of all trips in the Chicago suburbs are by car. 90%. Here's another number, 80%. That's how empty the typical car is when it's moving around. One person. You could hold 5, right? Plus some stuff in the trunk. It's at least 80% empty. Really inefficient. It's just not an efficient way to move people around, especially during rush hour. So we need it. So, and 28% of the region's population is in Chicago, which is great, but the rest is out in the suburbs. And the suburbs is, to a large extent, driving a lot of the problems, and has for decades now, that we just talked about in the previous panel in the city, right? The jobs have moved to the suburbs, to places where it's difficult to reach by transit. We are paving over the entire Chicago region to accommodate car travel in this auto-centric society. Most people never leave their homes without a car, not because they don't care about the environment or they don't want to be healthy or that they don't like to ride a bike. It's because it's so hard to get anywhere without a car because we've designed our communities around the car, right? And so our organization is all about trying to kind of change that. We're seeing a lot of progress in Chicago in particular, where more and more people are biking. transit ridership is growing by rail, but it's going way down on the buses, way down, about a 21% drop in the last 8 years, for example, in terms of bus ridership. So we're seeing improvement. My organization tends to get categorized as the bike group, but we're about more than biking. We also support transit and walking, and we want to see a more multimodal city of Chicago, but also more multimodal transportation in the suburbs.
Hi everyone, Mary Sue Barrett. I'm president of the Metropolitan Planning Council, and we're an independent organization that works across civic and community organizations, with government at every level every day, and also with the private sector to make our region the most vibrant, equitable, and sustainable. And our view is that we're not putting the pieces together in the way that we could. We have many, many assets. We all know them well, especially when some big opportunity like Amazon comes along. We start talking about that more, but also a little bit of wringing our hands about why things aren't working. So I'm delighted to be part of an infrastructure conversation because that's been a big part of our agenda. So we're not part of government, but because we work with government every day, we hope we can bring a little bit of the inspiration, so we do research, the advocacy, the coalescing of voices, and also some of the demonstration projects that show, yes, it can be done here. And we do all of those things on a range of growth and development issues, and I'm bullish about our assets, and I'm agitated about what we're not doing well, and that's, I think, what our panel is going to have a chance to talk about.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Clayton Harris. I am the executive director at the Illinois International Port District. So let me take a cue from Ron. I was going to do this. How many of you all know that we have a port here in Chicago? Okay, so that's a good start. A lot of people don't. And when I talk to a lot of people about what I do, they're like, we have a port there? I was like, well, there's this great big water, body of water, you know, just right over here. And yeah, ships come in to and through. So as the executive director, I've been there for about a year and some change now. One of the things I've been tasked with is to maintain and increase the viability of the port. And depending on who you ask and when you ask the question, the definition of viability obviously changes. One of the things that is paramount in my mission in keeping the port and maintaining and growing the viability of the port is talking about infrastructure, incorporating transportation, logistics movement. You know, even with the panel before, you have to talk about the environment, the community, and the different aspects of life in which the port touches, impacts, or influences, which is all aspects of city, urban, suburban, rural life, because all commodities come to and through. I was asked, well, you know, if the port went away tomorrow, what would happen? I was just like, well, you know, probably eventually stop eating. But if that's not important, then we don't have to worry about it. So we talk about the exchange of commodities. We look at the movement of freight and the logistics between all modes of transportation. So the port, the Illinois International Port District, or the Port of Chicago, is probably the greatest multimodal facility in North America, and it's getting that back to and through, and how we interact with all aspects of life.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Leanne Redden. I'm the Executive Director at the Regional Transportation Authority here in Chicago. I know this is probably kind of an inside baseball crowd, but you know, a lot of people actually don't know what the RTA does. We don't operate a single bus or train, but I think as importantly though, we are tasked with we're sort of the parent company with CTA, Metra, and PACE. We are largely responsible for the planning, the funding, and some oversight responsibilities of the three operators. So we have sort of the great fun task lately of sort of balancing budgets. And you know, historically people have heard stories about, you know, the infighting and we don't get along. I can say right now we're probably at the most collaborative and cooperative space we've ever been in, and I've been just in the transit space for about 12 years now, and in transportation my whole career. And the challenge is that we're all, you know, there's just not enough money to go around, and I think that'll be a theme that'll we'll tease out over the conversation. But more importantly, I think bringing back to sort of the topic for today, I think transit is fundamentally important. Ron rattled off a whole bunch of statistics, so I won't repeat any of those. But we're the thread, I think, that really keeps a vibrant economy together, that weaves things together. I think we are sort of that connection for economic viability. There's a lot more we could be doing. I'm Fortunately, I think we have a really strong foundation and a great transit network. We're the second largest transit system when you put the 3 operators together in the country. And our region's history has been built on a foundation of transportation, and a large chunk of that was transit. And unfortunately, though, I think because of political and other funding issues, we've sort of turned a bit of a blind eye and sort of somewhat kicked the can. And so we've got ourselves into these funding dire straits that aren't just unique to transit, but they are certainly a big issue for us to deal with. And for us to move forward, as Mary Sue just said, sort of she wants to be bold and be agitated, and I can be very much like that myself. I'm usually told to calm down a bit. But it's frustrating because I think we've got some of the greatest people thinking collectively on the same track, and we just don't have some of the wherewithal to get some of the things done. And conversation and advocacy is going to be a really key part.
Maybe money might be an interesting place to start. This panel is called Designing Transportation Systems for Smart Cities, and I know that part of the impetus was, when it was being planned months ago, was President Trump had been talking about this massive infrastructure bill, and there's this refocus on infrastructure in this country and what kinds of things could come out of it. And in some hypothetical other present, we might be debating how that bill actually came together and what came out of it passing. Of course, it hasn't actually materialized in a clear way yet, but maybe we can sort of take that as a prompt. If you folks had the chance to weigh in on some dream huge federal, maybe combined with the state infrastructure bill, what would be your priorities, and what would you push for, and how would you use it to rectify problems you see in the way that your transportation systems are being funded or sort of misfunded? And maybe we could start with you, Leah.
So my first words of advice to the Trump administration would be it has to include some real money. And I'm very excited that they're talking about infrastructure. What I worry about is a lot of it's on the potential on the backs of private equity money, gimmicks, tax credits, those kinds of things. And there is still, especially in many aspects of the public sector, a very real need for real money. We already leverage the federal dollar, the limited federal dollars we have, and we need to sort of leverage more. We bring stuff to the table at the local level, so we're not just walking in for a handout. Plus, I also like to, and I've had conversations with the administration, that this isn't a handout. There is a return on that investment. And it really ties back to jobs and economic viability of a region. We need to do a better job of telling that story, not just us in our region, but across the country. But it does have to be real money. It can't all be, we, unfortunately, the revenue that transit generates, for example, is the fares, and that goes largely into the operations of the system. We're not like a tollway where that money can sort of be leveraged into broader capital projects. We don't have as much of that spare cash to do some of those things. So that would be, I'll let the others talk about some of the other aspects.
Well, the Port District, so we're clear, we'll take anybody's money, right? So if it's given, we'll take it. We're in need of capital. So the issue with what's going on federally right now is, will there be real dollars behind the rhetoric? So, we're going to take proper advantage of anything that can be, will be, or should be available. But one of the things that we have to make sure that we also realize is that normally with the federal dollars coming to and through, there has to be a local match that comes with it. And one of the issues that we're dealing with, if we're talking about finances, is also the ability to generate revenue locally. And that's an issue that we have. And we have that bill, House Bill 1797, that was going through that would have helped us with our debt equity ratio that we were able to get through the House and the Senate, but was vetoed by the governor. So we are looking at more fundamental and closer issues for finance, and trying to be extremely agile and to think about multiple different ways that we can go. We have great partners in the city, the state, and the county moving through in the region because they recognize the international importance of the port and the Port Authority, and they also recognize, to Leanne's point, the revenue that is generated back from our operation. So the revenue that we generate for, let's just say in the tax dollars back to the state, we probably generate easily about $27 million annually on a minimum just in state revenue, and that doesn't account for the probably 157, I think, in federal tax dollars that go back. So when people start to look at what they are investing in, And that's really what I have to make sure people understand when we go for grants and other funding, that this is not a handout, but this is an investment back into the city, the state, the county, the region, and what we do. So,
I want to expand your question because the concept of waiting for Washington is not such a smart strategy ever, and particularly now, given this uncertainty. And I'd expand that to say same thing with the state. So we're in an era of self-help. That doesn't mean the feds in the state get off the hook with infrastructure investment. There is a clear case to be made on return on investment, especially when we coordinate water, sewer, housing, education, transportation investment. That kind of targeted investment, when we do that, we really see a ripple multiplier effect in community after community. One we gave an award to earlier this year was the community of Pullman on Chicago's far southeast side, a neighbor of the Port District. In Pullman, they have done a number of things, including extending South Lakeshore Drive, bringing in local employers like Method, the Whole Foods distribution facility, a number of job generating and workforce, housing rehab, the whole gamut. And our quantification was that that community, because of coordinated investment and leadership, was outperforming by far their surrounding communities. This is not an easy community to turn around, but Pullman put all the pieces together. And on a big scale, that's what we're trying to do as a city and as a region. So we need the federal government as our full partner. I'll give you an example of self-help. So the Red Purple Line modernization is one of the top priorities of RTA and the Chicago Transit Authority. So it's been on our to-do list. By the way, the backlog of need, just so you have a number, is $43 billion over 10 years. That's just to catch up on the basics. It's not covering all of the important new stuff that we need to be talking about. So we need some new revenue sources for the taking care of what we've got and for the new expansion. So there was, at the tail end of the Obama administration, there was $1.1 billion that was available, had been available to this project. And it requires, as all federal dollars do, a local match. Wasn't happening, no state action. City budgets were under stress, clearly, CTAs. And so the idea of creating a zone, people sometimes call it a transit TIF. That's not exactly an accurate description, but it's a zone around the Red and Purple Line North Side extension, North Side modernization rather, that is allowed to capture incremental increases in real estate. One of the concerns about TIF, legitimately, is that it redirects growth of the property tax that would have gone to Chicago Public Schools for that period of 23 years. This one carves out the Chicago Public Schools. So it takes away that issue of you're hurting the schools, and you're adding the benefit of you're helping transit. So I think that this kind of approach, which was actually enacted a year ago, was utilized to access those dollars, and now that project is next phase moving forward. So we have to explore more and more of those kinds of things, and then say to Washington, look, we've got a track record. You've got, Tollway's done a bunch of great projects. RTA has done. We have a crisis of confidence, really, that if the dollars come, that they can go to good things. Mm-hmm. So I look to the feds, but I also, think we have to look at ourselves and say, what are the next mechanisms to capture growth in the marketplaces and in the sectors that are changing for our region? And transit needs sustainable revenue. All of our transportation needs sustainable revenue, not this boom and bust capital cycle.
Ron, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Mary Sue's right that we have to look more and more towards local funding sources to really support ourselves. Even during the Obama administration, which was relatively friendly towards transit, for example, even back then we were not especially optimistic that there would be more money flowing to Illinois and Metro Chicago, and I think that's even less likely now under the current administration. So, and also, it's, again, from our perspective at Active Transportation Alliance, we're very skeptical about highway expansion. I've got an op-ed I think it's in the Sun-Times today. Check it out. All about how highway expansion just really doesn't relieve congestion in the long run. It exacerbates our car-dependent problems that I talked about earlier. And we should really be spending that money instead on things that do work to relieve congestion, create transportation equity, improve the environment, so on and so forth. Now that's a hard task because, just like federal and state agriculture policy is hardwired to grow corn, federal and state transportation policy is hardwired to grow highways. And this is just the reality that we live in. I'm hoping that CMAP, our local metropolitan planning organization, as part of the GO-TO 2050 process, will get on board with this notion that we have to get away from highway expansion, suburban sprawl, and the status quo. That we have to really look to new ways of doing things, and that will involve some local funding sources like Mary Sue talked about. If you look at Denver, Los Angeles, they've all taxed themselves to expand and improve their transit systems. We need to for sure lobby hard for federal and state money, that's absolutely true. But we're going to have to find some new local revenue sources to really grow transit and just to maintain the stuff we have already.
I want to follow this idea of investment the next bit. I think folks, myself included, don't tend to think about some of the transit systems we use unless they're either A, there's a big expansion or a project on the horizon, or B, they're busted and the train doesn't come and the road has a pothole. But I don't often have the thought of, man, I hope we're adequately funding Blue Line renovation so that it continues to run. But that's a huge issue, right, for anybody working in transportation is maintaining what you have and making sure it's up to snuff. But I also imagine that can be, balancing that can be difficult, which is sort of my next question, which is, when you look to the limited funds that you have, the limited funds that will be coming in, and also the future of whatever sort of networks you're involved with, and making sure that they're relevant and people are engaged with them in this area, how do you try and balance maintaining with what you have with, say, an exciting new project? And maybe we could actually start with you, Ron, because I don't know how that comes up for bicycles.
Right. Oh, well, bikes are easy, relatively speaking. It's so inexpensive. I mean, seriously, the cost to build out, for example, so there's a lot of new bike lanes, as you probably noticed, in Chicago the last 7-8 years in particular. And I haven't seen the most recent update, but it was, I think somewhere in the order of like $25-30 million to build out more than 100 miles of advanced bike lanes, along with a number of other amenities to promote cycling. And that's just like a rounding error, for your typical highway or transportation projects. So it's relatively easy to do some of these bicycle projects. Often the main limitation will be just political, and a big part of our job at Active Trans is to help do the organizing, the mobilizing, to bring out the folks who really do support these projects and kind of do the education and the encouragement to bring folks around. I think we survived the bike lash, we called it, back in 2011. Some of you may remember it, with certain Tribune columnists and others just railing against what's going on, and I still hear a lot of complaints about cyclists, and we get that. But the good news is we're creating more order on the streets. We're starting to see people in cars, people on bikes, learning how to coexist better. The numbers are growing quite quickly. The more difficult task is funding transit, making sure that we're actually maintaining what we have, while at the same time not just ignoring the need to expand the system as well, even though we recognize that today it's hard to think about how to pay for that, right? But we also know that transportation projects take a long, long time to plan and develop, and the funding environment that exists today will certainly, we hope, change and improve down the road to the point where we can build some of the new projects that have been discussed.
Leanne, maybe you could go next. I know this is a big issue for planning RTA in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, probably 5-6 years ago, we really we basically said, no new expansion. We just don't have, even though everybody wants shiny, bright, and new, we just don't have the financial wherewithal, and it's fiscally irresponsible if we sort of turn our back on the existing infrastructure that we have. The hard part for us is telling the story and selling the story about, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a switching system that nobody sees. And that infrastructure is old, it's expensive, and so I think the service boards are doing a much better job, I think, about explaining some of those. It's about reliability and getting more trains through a signal or a switching area to enhance and try and turn these issues into customer-facing conversations. I think the service boards, CTA, Metro, and PACE, have done a pretty good job too in the last several years. Even though they're taking care of the existing infrastructure they have, they very much kind of, I think, initially started their focus on customer-facing aspects of that. So you're seeing new rail cars, you're seeing new information systems, you're seeing real-time information, station improvements. So some of those customer-facing things, so people can, that they are more tangible to the average rider. And now we've got the tough, and I always say the tough and less sexy stuff, the invisible stuff that we have to fund and pay for. So it's bridges, it's signals, it's track. And we just don't have enough money. I mean, Mary Sue threw out the big number of the backlog, but I mean, we should be spending $2 to $3 billion a year just to maintain the existing infrastructure we have. And yes, with that, you get a few nice, shiny pieces to it, but it's not really drastically, it's not expanding anything. And we're spending about $800 million a year. And that's all the money we have. And that's even cobbling together some of the creative resources out of sort of looking forward on TIF and some of the value capture concepts. So it really is a cobbling together of all these pieces that really just present almost insurmountable challenges sometimes. And I think what we have to do is kind of peel it apart into small bite-sized chunks, sound bites sometimes, so you can get an elected official or the general public to kind of understand how we're chipping away at this stuff. But again, keeping some of these smaller, you know, the Ventra app and things like that. I mean, the real-time customer information. I mean, I travel the world and the country, and you know, we've got some pretty good things here. People tend to think we're, you know, everywhere else is better, but I actually think we've got some pretty good features here that we take for granted sometimes.
A little bit of a contrarian view, which is unusual because Leanne and I, our agencies work together a lot.
It's the point of the panel, though.
Exactly. I think that we suffer from Midwest modest.
Yes, absolutely.
We think, you know, let's just focus on, you know, the knitting and the maintenance, and we know it's not sexy, but let's try really hard to sell it. Not working. So I think we have to like blow it up and say, you know, we're going to tag along all that maintenance, which absolutely has to come first, has to be done, has to be funded, needs reliable revenue, and we have to get people excited about what's coming next. To go with Ron's statistics earlier, we have way low transit ridership and threats from shared services like Lyft and Uber, which we don't fully understand its impact on transit. But the central business district still, when you look at the total incoming flow of people, 66% get there by transit into the loop. And we would absolutely not have a loop if we didn't have this multi-service transit network. And entities like Google said they came to the West Loop because there was this new Morgan Street station. So we've brought on board two new stations. They were actually both designed by Carol Ross Varney, the Cermak Green Line and the Morgan Street station near South, near West. And you see how it supports new job centers, mixed-use centers. So we have to tell people, like, what are the next 5 upgraded metro stations? What are the next 5 new infill CTA stations? What's the next bus rapid transit? You know, we've been talking about it on Ashland, let's do it. What's the,
on North Lakeshore Drive.
Lakeshore Drive multimodal dedicated lane. I mean, there's some big ideas, they have big price tags, and if we tell people that's the benefit, I believe that's why Denver and Los Angeles and other places got it done. So we, a few years ago, formed a coalition called Accelerated Illinois, and one of the things I've been looking forward to is to share with this audience today is that we're committed to getting it back from kind of pause mode, which we've been waiting for the budget pension issues to work their way through, to more active mode. And I can't look in my crystal ball to say whether 2018 is the year that we can get something done at the state level and get some regional resources, but we have a gubernatorial election. We have a lot of candidates, and we have to educate all of them about what we must have, because this is the slowest growing city, region, and state. Slowest of any one. So infrastructure's been our calling card. We have to think beyond maintenance. We have to think about something big and bold that's going to put us back on the path of growth. So I think infrastructure can be exciting.
Real quick, so actually, sort of to piggyback on what Mary Sue just said, we're actually doing a 5-year plan right now, and the hope is to actually have an investment plan, and I call it an investment plan very specifically. And there's really three three key goals that we want to walk away with, besides a list of actual projects that we want people to sort of rally and get behind. But it's, speaking about delivering the value on that investment, building on the strengths of the existing network, which sort of crosses between sort of the maintenance, but thinking about the future, as well as staying competitive, because they're really three key things that I think the landscape is changing around us, and we have to be responsive. But we have a document that we can use with the public, with the media, with legislators, so we've actually got something that people can actually rally behind and sort of put the puzzle pieces that I think Mary Sue referred to in the beginning together to actually try to get some of these projects done.
Clayton, you wanna weigh in?
Well, sure, yeah, and I guess to be a little bit more contrary to the last couple of things that were going on, I don't deal with public transportation. I deal with transportation that affects the public. So it's the other way around. So what we need to do is we have to invest in our infrastructure. We have to go back and look at the deferred maintenance aspect of it. So when you talk about, the Metropolitan Planning Committee, when you talk about the Regional Transportation Authority and active transportation, and you talk about bicycles and different things that you all see or interact with regularly, I get it. But the interaction, nobody's coming to hang out at the port. Not really.
I do sometimes.
Right. You should come down. It's not. But the issue is when people picture a port in their mind, they're probably picturing a West Coast or an East Coast port, and they think about containers being stacked up and gantry cranes and all this good stuff. And we're not that. We're a break bulk port, and so we deal with steel ingots, and commodities that are on the ground and everything. And I had one guy, he came up to me, he's just like, we're parking cruise ships at your port, or at the port. And maybe he didn't know I was the executive director. He's like, have you ever been over there? He's like, it's a junkyard. I was like, well, I don't think I'd call it a junkyard. And he's like, but have you ever been there? He's like, it's scrappy. I was like, well, my office is right there. And he's like, oh, well, I mean, I was like, it's all right. The issue is people have seen the port, but they've never come there and looked at the port. So when you talk about this and this interaction, sometimes if you just see the port and you see the failing infrastructure that we have there, you might picture it as a junkyard. I tell people we're classically Chicago. There are parts of us that don't look pretty, but we get things done. And it's just like Chicago. Hey, we can do this, right? And we're working on this aspect of it, and that's kind of where we are. But for us, the investment has to be in the deferred maintenance, because everyone's like, well, you need to grow to generate revenue. We need revenue to grow. So that's the conundrum. So I get it and appreciate where Ron is, and he's right. He's like, well, it's bicycles, it's relatively easy. And you talk about, well, we have to do front facing. You talk about the different aspects that people look at. Well, mine's hard as hell. I gotta balance everything, or I have all these balls up in the sky at the same time, and the goal is to get them to land at the same time. Because if one lands or doesn't land at the same time as the other, everything. Not everything, because they hired me for a reason, but it could fall apart. So
you folks all have the task of trying to maintain your networks or the port, trying to grow, limited funds, and you have to make your case, like Clayton was just talking about. So maybe before we move on, I could just ask: do you have a moment that you remember of breaking through to somebody who controls the purse strings? Maybe we can start with you, Clayton. It seems like you might have the hardest task.
Well, I thought we did it. We had House Bill 1797. Nutshell, this bill, when people describe it, they're like, well, it's just a loan forgiveness bill, and it's a lot more than that. But if you boil it down, I'll accept that. The port carries about $30 million in debt, and this bill would have alleviated $15 million. Basically, there was kind of a loan. It was really more land for anticipation of containerizing given to the port, $15 million by the state about 39 years ago. Containerized never came here. It was recognized about 38 years ago that this wasn't going to happen. And about 36 years ago, Capital Development Board wrote it off. So they were like, the state's never going to get this money back. So for the last almost 40 years, the port's been carrying a $15 million debt that we've never made a payment on, nor been required, so we're not in default for $15 million. Now, when I go to a bank or if I want a bond, And they're like, hey, what's this $15 million debt that you haven't made a payment on in 40 years? Don't worry about that. And they're like, no, we are worried about that. Right, and I get it, right? It's like your own home. I told you, when I get excited, I start to talk fast. But I tell people, I'm not talking fast, you're listening slow, so keep up. So we got this bill, and then we come through. So this bill, people agree on, okay, it'll come back, it'll erase the debt. So I explained to everyone, it doesn't create a $15 million hole for the state. It was already written off. And it doesn't enrich us, because people are like, well, you're just going to get $15 million. No. It just allows us to erase a number so that maybe a year from now, I can go talk to someone without them laughing. So my aha or breakthrough moment, right? Get down to committee down in Springfield. They're laughing. Oh, it's very audacious for you to come before we had a budget and ask the state to forgive, $15 million. I was like, one of my favorite authors had this book about the audacity of hope. So I'm hoping that you all listen to what I'm saying. So we get it out of House committee, get it on the floor. We have the debate in the House floor. Passes the House. Get all these calls. They're like, how'd you do that? I'm like, I don't know. It goes over to Senate committee, almost the exact same thing. Get it out of committee. On the Senate floor, massive debate. People who voted against it in committee ended up voting for it on the floor. I was like, we did it. Very bipartisan, very, very bipartisan. It's great, everyone sees it, and then the governor vetoed it. So my breakthrough moment was, and man, the House ball, the Senate ball hit the ground before the gubernatorial ball did.
Leanne, you talked about having to put things into sound bites. Are there any that have been particularly effective any time you've broken through?
I guess I don't feel like we've had the success at the state or the federal level yet on sort of an en masse basis. And it's really frustrating. I mean, isn't this the city of broad shoulders? Where did its moxie go? And that's sort of to build on Mary Sue's point. It's frustrating. I think we've had success at sort of small and individual decision makers. I kind of like to feel like we've actually had some success in the family. With our 3 service board operators, it's almost a sort of, sometimes I feel like it's almost a war zone mindset. It's like they've been so beaten up, so beaten down, and there's been so little money for so long. I mean, we haven't had a state capital program since 2009. And even some of those monies were never realized. So it's sort of this, like, just cobble together what you can so the buses and trains keep running. And it's a real, it wears you down, that mindset for so long. So I think the fact that we're actually to the point of doing this plan, this 5-year plan, which will have projects in it, for them to actually stop, sort of, to segment the conversation about what am I just going to do with this $800 million, or my slice of that $800 million from a year-to-year basis, versus if we had $2 to $3 billion a year, what would we do? And tell a story around that. And that finally, we're all collectively, because we are a family, sometimes dysfunctional, we love each other and we hate each other sometimes too, but that's largely because it's hard for us all to get along because there's so many challenges. But I think that's my sort of small breakthrough for now, and we hope if we can stay together and get that plan, then we take that on the road and then start just chipping away. I don't think there's any I don't see any sea change politically, either at the federal or at the state level, to really sort of be able to just kind of run in. The other point I keep making to people is, what are we scared of? We've got nothing now. So what do we got to lose, right? I mean, if we get something more, they're like, well, what if we don't get that? And then people have expectations. I think we have to raise expectations to keep the pressure on to actually do some things.
Yeah, outstanding.
Mary Sue?
Yeah, the job's that big, for sure. I think that there are lessons from the 30 states that have raised sustainable revenue, dedicated source, since Illinois has dealt with this. So it's, we're being left in the dust. And they all look a little different. In Denver, which we've referenced a few times, it was really expanding transit on a regional basis. And it was they called it fast tracks. So it was about jump starting, and Los Angeles used a similar mindset of like, let's come up with dollars so that we can do what we have a dream or a plan that's been adopted for 30 years. We're going to do it in 10. So this idea of accelerating so that you start to get the job benefits. And I do think that theme is clearly one to lead with. Yes, sustainability, yes, equity, but I'm talking about for everyone. And that kind of job boosting is what is clearly needed with our economy. Not in the sense that it usually is. You see a road builder voice or an operating engineer voice, and it starts to look like special interest. For too long, those have been the leading voices for advocacy. So I think all of us, especially organizations like the Active Transportation Alliance, are trying to very much broaden that. We use some mobile technology when we were forming Accelerate Illinois, just to get people to submit pictures and videos of their commute horror story. And I mean, they were fascinating. And they made for really interesting fodder of like, what's making you angry? Send us your bill of that, that repair for your axle that cost you $650. And so that's what people want to talk about. What's the benefit? If I have these enhanced transportation options, well, then maybe I'm not going to get dinged with a $20 late fee for my kid's daycare center because the reliability wasn't there. It's not just about the big projects, it's about the quality of life impacts, and telling that story. I think we could do a much better job.
I have two quick the question is breakthroughs, examples of breakthroughs, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I have two quick stories. One related to transportation. So back when I worked for the American Lung Association, we were advocating for legislation to require diesel trucks to have their exhaust tested, just like cars do. It was a big complaint back then. It still is. It's gotten better. And long story short, we were doing tons of organizing and working with lots of different groups. And the Illinois Trucking Association was not pleased. I was being threatened. I was being pushed, literally, physically pushed around outside of the committee hearing rooms. We brought down some high school kids who had done visual inspections, and they were awesome, sharing their results, and the state senator just shouted them down, and they were like, ooh. The story, though, is later that day, I was called into Speaker Madigan's office, and he said, I'm going to sponsor your bill. Boom, done. It passed. That was cool. That was a breakthrough right there, because he said, this is something that everybody supports except for the Trucking Association. We're going to do this. And so that actually happened a long time ago. The second story is more recent, when we met with then candidate Rahm Emanuel, and Mary Sue was part of this. We had a sustainable transportation platform that we were taking around to all the mayoral candidates back in 2010-11. And we were talking about protected bike lanes, and we asked all the candidates to commit to 100 miles of new protected bike lanes during their first term. And we were sharing photographs from Portland, and I was explaining to Rahm Emanuel that Portland's way ahead of us. We really need to catch up, and his response was, and I'm going to paraphrase here, screw Portland. Screw Portland, we're going to show them. And
I used to live in Portland. It's a nice
there
place.
you go, yeah. Anyway, so he took that commitment for real, and a lot of progress has been made since then. So that's just an example of where you had a candidate who was already on board, and it was just a matter of kind of giving him the right information and helping him. And we spent the last 7 years really working with the city to build out that bike lane network.
So part of, I imagine, you folks' jobs as transportation planners is pushing the city towards a direction the direction that you believe is the best place for it to go, to making it a smarter city, like this panel calls it. But there's probably the question, and a question I was thinking about is this sort of chicken or egg phenomenon. Like, how do you bring people along with you, and how do you make sure that they're with you enough that they sort of take to what you're trying to give them? And so maybe to phrase that question a little bit more specifically, like Ron was just talking about, bike lanes are an issue in Chicago, and there's been this sort of back and forth over the last few years of, the bike lanes are created to facilitate more biking, and then drivers and people who live in those areas sometimes push back. Sometimes Tribune columnists push back because they lose parking spaces, the roads become more congested. They aren't able to do things the way they've always done them. And so the way I'd put this question is, do you push towards where you think the data and studies show we should be going, and then hope people catch up? Do you wait for them to be ready? How do you find that balance? And we can start with you, Ron.
Well, what we found is that when you lay out all the facts, people generally get on board with improvements to we refer to these as complete streets improvements. They're not just bike lanes. And in fact, it's much more effective to talk about and to really design the street changes to be more holistic. In other words, not just around bikes. You want to go in there and really redesign the street in a way that makes it safer and better for everyone. And often putting in a bike, not always, but often putting in a bike lane is part of that more comprehensive approach, right? So because a bike lane will not only create more order on the streets, so the bikes know where they belong, the cars know that they're over here, so on and so forth, but it also will slow the cars down. You know, on most Chicago streets, you're not going to average in a car more than 10, 15 miles per hour, no matter how fast you go between the red lights. Right, we call this racing to the red. It does no good. You're not going to get home any faster. But people go flying 40 miles per hour up to the next red light. And so the bike lane will actually help slow those cars down. And you can also couple it with better crosswalks and countdown timers and things like that. So generally speaking, you want to, because not most people don't bike, we know that. So you want to talk about how we can redesign the street in a way that makes it safer and better and more orderly for everybody. That needs to be the approach. And what we found is that generally, that works. People generally get on board with that. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're taking out parking, that's always going to be controversial. Most of the bike lanes that have gone in Chicago haven't done that.
Leanne, does that come up with the RTA?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ron's touching on sort of that complete streets and taking a holistic philosophy on things, and we absolutely support that, and gets to some of the areas that we don't get control, like land use, and that are really fundamentally important to the success of any of these other bigger investments. Sort of back to also your original question, I think I have three words: millennials and baby boomers, because I think those ends of the demographic spectrum are really going to drive change, and I think they're the audiences that just who they are and where they are at in their phases of life are actually huge opportunities, I think, as well as for us to sort of preach to, if you will. I mean, they're preaching back to us, actually. But, you know, they're an audience that are receptive to, you know, the shared economy, different ways of moving around, sort of on both ends of the spectrum. And I think they're audiences that are, I think, very important for us as we move forward.
I think if the advocates get accused sometimes of being preachy, I think that is unfair, because really the common denominator here is choice. And when you connect with people about choice, Complete Streets is about giving people more choices. My office is at Adams and Dearborn, where there's that two-way Dearborn bike path, and people were just, you know, agitated about that when first implemented, property owners as well. And Dearborn's throughput is just as good as ever before. It's safer. You know, people don't necessarily think about the fact that streets are for all modes, and that's what the Complete Streets mindset does. Lakeshore Drive, certain times a day, carries as many people on buses as in cars, and yet the debate too often about North Lakeshore Drive redo is about, you know, well, we got to maintain, you know, we can't possibly talk about a dedicated lane for transit because we got to help people get from the northern suburbs into the city. We got to help all people get around, and I think if we're embracing that and then telling stories along with data, that will be much more effective in saying, we're actually trying to give you what you want. And the other piece I wanted to just interject is that this is within the environment that today is changing. Add into that autonomous vehicles. And we have a huge new dynamic about how we're going to be using our public way.
Clayton, do you want to add?
Well, sure. Complete Streets means a little bit different for us at the port. So we have dirt roads. So Complete Street would be paving. Right. So our deal, to the extent that I'm relevant in this question, is the interaction between the different modals. So our main drive at Lake Calumet, at least, is Butler Drive, and then there's rail that goes straight down the center. And then we have extremely heavy truck traffic that comes to and through. And so those three modes right there, and then we have regular traffic that comes through, and then on the other side of the transit sheds are the barges. So those modes, and keeping those together, that's our Complete Street aspect of it. But we do have dirt roads.
So as we move towards the end of our time, I wanted to bring up a theme that the last panel talked about a lot, which was how do you get everybody involved in these decisions and make sure you're sort of thinking about the community in general. And just a quick story here. Before I was a reporter at WBEZ, I was a reporter in the state of Wyoming. It's very different place. But the story I did there that sort of stayed with me that I think about a lot is in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a couple years back, they moved the DMV. So the DMV had been in downtown Cheyenne, just a normal building. Cheyenne's only 60,000 people, but it was as dense a part of Cheyenne as it gets. And And they moved it to a bright, shiny new building. It's huge, on the side of the highway. No sidewalk and no bus. And the story I did was I met a bunch of folks who actually were living in a homeless shelter, sort of people who were on the margins of Cheyenne society who couldn't get to the DMV, they couldn't take the bus, they either had to walk on the side of the highway or maybe try and find a ride, and it created a lot of problems for them because you need an ID to get a job. There's a lot of reasons you need to go to the DMV that maybe you don't think about until you can't get there. And the planners just, it had just not factored into their decisions because that was not the group of people that came into their mind when they thought about who they were serving. Everybody else had a way better DMV experience. And so I just want to sort of put this out there and see, if it brings up any thoughts about how in each of your jobs you think about catching the perspective that you might be predisposed to miss. Maybe we could start with you, Mary Sue.
Transformative project and effort we've been involved with probably many of you and organizations you're involved with. It's called the Cost of Segregation. We've been working with the Urban Institute, and it's about bringing an equity of opportunity lens and understanding the cost of our current patterns. We looked at places where big and diverse, more so than Cheyenne, and that were at the average on segregation, economic and racial segregation. So think of places like Raleigh-Durham, Houston, Atlanta. And how did they fare compared to here? So we found that if we were like them, we would have $4.4 billion more in annual income, which is a gross regional product impact of $8 billion, 83,000 more bachelor's degrees, and 30% fewer homicides. So you ask yourself, this is the status quo, and what does this have to do with transportation? It's because we don't bring this equity, inclusion lens to every decision we make, and we need to do that with transportation. Credit to the Secretary of IDOT, who used to be the head of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, Randy Blankenhorn, who you'll be hearing from, for bringing a criteria-based system. If we did that, we would look at facilities like the Port District, parts of the Regional Transportation Authority's network, and say, well, that is more deserving and should be a higher prioritization because it hits multiple pieces. And I think that that's what happens when you site a facility in the wrong place. It's far more than the homeless population that was inconvenienced. All those people who transact business through downtown Cheyenne, it is more inconvenient for them too. It's not all about parking, it's about services and choices. So if you don't have a system to ask yourself those questions, you don't ask yourself about what's the fair differential affordability that we should build into our next funding piece. Do you remember Governor Blagojevich putting the free fare for seniors out there? Crazy, no means testing, and then a number of senior citizens came back and said, we didn't want this, we want to support our transit system. But we don't provide a discount for transit fares other than for students. So these are the things we have to grapple with and bring into the system, and I think that community dialogue is going to drive those changes.
Leanne?
Echo a lot of what Mary Sue said. We do actually provide other discounts. I think in the federally regulated space in the transit world, we do have to, there's very specific criteria we have to evaluate in terms of services, which gets to why some people say, oh, that's inefficient. That's, there's sort of broader social equity and access questions that we have to deal with, so you don't always get to operate the most efficient transit system ever. And that's some of the trade-offs we have to make. I've had people come and say, you should be running this like a business. Well, it's not meant to run like a business. The transit system we have came from the private sector when they didn't want to and couldn't afford to run it any longer. And so we have to think more broadly about some of these social and economic factors in all the decisions we make in terms of service levels, fares, and coverage. So it's a challenge. I think we don't do it great. I think funding often becomes a big impediment to doing sort of better and more. But I do think I think we do a decent job. It doesn't mean we can't continue to improve and make sure we've got a very focused lens.
Well, to borrow from the previous panel, I would say that I think maybe Gia said it or whatnot, you have to meet people where they are. So in my first year and a half, I never denied anyone a meeting. Everybody has a plan for the port. And so I asked for them, and that whittled down as many people who said that they actually had a plan for the port. And we got them, and what I said was, if we lay everybody's plan on top of one another, I guarantee you we're probably going to find some commonality. And if we start from there, then we can move forward. You have to take everyone's desires into account, whether you like them or not, whether you want them or not. And like I said, my first year, I met with everyone who wanted a meeting. Now, I won't be doing that my second year, but I'm just being honest. But right. I heard, but truly you have to meet people where you are, and you have to be, and if y'all truly knew me, you know how magnanimous this statement is. You got to be humble enough to understand that you don't know everything. So I'm the executive director, right? So I'm responsible for everything, but I don't know everything. So me taking a step back and listening to urban planners, which that's not my degree, me listening to the environmental advocates, the conservation, the industry folks, you got to bring it all together. And one of the things that we have done is we put out a 5-year plan. And in our 5-year plan, we have our ERIC initiative, and that deals with the environment and economics, recreation and resource, innovation and industry, and conservation and community. So it's meeting people where they are, recognizing you don't have all the answers, and then going back and incorporating what you've heard and learned.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. Local voices are clearly the most knowledgeable and powerful and most persuasive when it comes to creating change. They know their communities best, and so listening and making sure you've incorporated all that. And I think a good example from our perspective is in our work in some of the lower income communities in Chicago, we've what we often hear in terms of meeting people where they are is, gee whiz, there aren't enough good jobs nearby, and B, it's hard to get there by transportation, especially if you can't afford to own a car, right? Or you're not physically able to drive a car. So as much as we love biking at the Active Transportation Alliance, what we're hearing from a lot of our low-income communities is focus on transit, because that's far more people are going to use transit to get where they're going than ride a bike. And that may change someday, I hope it does, but that's where we are right now, right? And that's where they are. So for example, we've been working with the Metro Electric Coalition on the south side to try to persuade Metro and others, RTA, others to find a way to run that service more like a CTA-style service with closer stops, more frequent service. We think that could be a huge asset to the south side of Chicago. And this is something we're hearing from residents is better transit. But we also know that in the bigger picture, as long as the jobs keep going out to the suburbs, not near, in places that really aren't accessible by transit, we're going to continue to struggle to connect people, especially low-income populations, with these jobs. And we're hearing that loud and clear. And we're not going to resolve that problem solely by talking amongst ourselves in this room or talking about this foundation or that. Ultimately, that boils down to every single municipality in the region, the Illinois Department of Transportation, the governor, so on and so forth. And so I hope you'll keep that in mind when you hear Secretary Blankenhorn talk later on.
Seems like a good time to get into some audience questions. I think we have a mic for you, too.
Hello, okay, thank you. So Nicole Johnson, Southside native. We spoke about the cost of segregation in the last bit. One thing I would like to encourage the panel, particularly RTA and the Planning Council, is to possibly take an assessment of the bus stops, particularly where the buses stop, like in 8A, and then it picks up the 8. So I bring this up because there's a bus stop on 79th and Halsted, and I've been using it since '96 when I was living in Washington Heights and when I went to Inglewood. And it's been the same, right? It's not a safe space. The glass is like the glass that you can't see through. It's cloudy. So if we want people to use the public transportation, it has to be safe. It has to be well lit. It has to have benches. There should be a heating mechanism during the winter months because it's a gangway. It's in between two buildings, so it can get kind of cold there. So my suggestion would be to take assessment of those sites across the city, not necessarily ones that are in like Jackson and Van Buren, where they had that new one across the street from Union Station, the new port there. Like, we should have that all across the city so the CTA can be used as a quality form of transportation for all citizens and residents of the city.
Leanne, do you want to speak to that?
Well, I know CTA has a commitment to safety across their entire system. They do regularly evaluate sort of the routes and the system. A lot of the shelters are actually contracted out through the city of Chicago, so there's kind of a relationship there. But I can certainly take that point back to CTA and specifically that location and have them take a look too.
More questions? You, sir? Who's looking around?
Should the city focus more on upgrading and expanding the Blue Line rather than try to build, even with private money, an express train to O'Hare that would probably degrade Blue Line service?
Well, the CTA is very much focused on Your New Blue, which is a very specific project to enhance the existing and improve the existing Blue Line. I'm not intimately engaged with the Airport Express, but from my understanding, maybe Mary Sue, you might have even had a bit more conversation, but that's actually kind of being run specifically out of the mayor's office as a way to look at, could they bring private equity investors in to build a separate service that would specifically serve that market. So it's not taking away from any investment or any dollars that we would have to invest into the existing infrastructure. The look is to look at new money. Now, whether that comes to fruition, it's been talked about for a long time. So I don't really have I don't think it's not taking away anything from the Blue Line and the enhancements that CTA is actually investing in along that line.
Questions for other members?
Quick addition to that is Leanne's right that we have to make sure something new, a totally new service, expanded train to O'Hare would not detract resources from the ongoing maintenance. But we also have to market what we've got. I want a real-time signage at every gate that says time to traffic on the Kennedy, run it with the traffic reports, time to traffic, time to city on the CTA, and the price, $5, right there, so that people can make some choices. They don't have to hunt for where the train is at the O'Hare. They can make a decision about $30 versus $5 in time to time. And we have to market and help people get comfortable and familiar with our great service of the Blue Line.
We are beyond the threshold of major technological changes in transportation. And I was wondering if the panel could tell me what have we been doing about it? What should we be doing about it? How should we be thinking about it? And is there a danger in doing some major transit projects which may be outdated by the time they're built?
Well,
Ideas?
as far as, I'm not sure what technology you're referring to. There's a lot we could be discussing. If you're referring to autonomous vehicles, for example, okay. Sure. Well, let me kind of focus first on the whole kind of new mobility services, quote unquote, combined with autonomous vehicles. The Transit Center out of New York did a nice report recently making the case that, and I think this is true, that none of those services are going to ultimately replace public transportation. They may actually dovetail with and become a part of public transportation, but we're going to still need public transportation. Certainly we're not going to be able to move nearly, you just physically can't move the number of people we move on public transportation in, personal automobiles that hold like 3 or 4 or 5 people. So having said that, we also know that these new mobility services, there's pretty strong indications that they are eating into public transportation ridership in Chicago and elsewhere. It's not 100% sure, but it looks pretty likely. And so we're all trying to kind of grapple with what that looks like. And I know that the mayor's office and others are looking at policies to address that. So I'm going to stop there and let others maybe talk about the other technologies that you were referring to.
I think we can let Randy do that next.
Right.
I see him standing in the wings.
Yeah, there you go.
I should say Secretary of Transportation.
Right.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
Do you have
okay.
a court question?
No.
Okay. So,
You have to answer it, whatever it is.
yeah, you have to answer it,
I used to
Clayton.
be over at IDOT and CDOT. I can
there
talk
you
about
go.
transportation, but I figured you want the experts, and I'm cool just sitting here.
Well, questions for Rob and Mary Sue, particularly. I got here today via rail and bike from the suburbs.
Me too.
Yeah, from McHenry County. I am infinitely safer bicycling in downtown Chicago than I am in the suburbs. And I don't know how we have, on our major thoroughfares, we have miles and miles of strip malls that aren't connected with any kind of a pedestrian and bicycle frontage. Well, if you get to one of those giant strip malls and you want to go in, there's no safe pedestrian and bicycle route to get into them. We have sidewalks downtown. I've literally seen 200-foot long strips of sidewalk that start and end nowhere. Yep. There's very little coordination. So at what level are you advocating across counties and within municipalities as a part of those counties for better?
Sure.
I mean, we do have PACE buses now. I almost ran off the road the first time I saw one, so I was pretty excited about that. But
That's funny. Well, yeah, Active Transportation Alliance, we put out our Suburban Bikeways for All report just a few weeks ago. Check that out. It kind of lays out the key ingredients for how suburbs can make their communities more friendly